Mute yan, di ba? Ay,
Hindi,
hindi
hindi.
namin.
Nakamute. Test ko ba?
Hindi. I-testing lang natin yung speaker.
Okay.
Yan. Malakas na siya.
Okay.
Okay. Tama na yan. Hindi na kailangan yung yung microphone.
Mic check, mic check. Check, mic test, hello, check.
Short. Hello. Good afternoon. We are ready to start this afternoon's forum entitled The Paradox of Foreign Aid and Donor Self-Interest. Before we start, as we start, I'd like to ask all of you to stand up for the national anthem. Please be seated. Good afternoon once again, and a warm welcome to this afternoon's forum on the paradox of foreign aid and donor self-interest. I am Thetis Abrera Mangajas. I will be your host, moderator this afternoon. I'm a proud alumna of the UP School of Economics, and if it is of any relevance to this forum, I was the last few years spent over a decade at the International Labor Organization, where I oversaw quite a number of ILO's technical cooperation projects in the Asia-Pacific region. This afternoon, I'd like to acknowledge the presence of several dignitaries here in the crowd. But first, let me start off by acknowledging the Dean of the UP School of Economics, Dean Joy Abrenica, of course, and the UP and her UP faculty, UP School of Economics faculty members. Of course, I see Noel de Dios here, Mr. Manny Esguerra earlier, Dr. Florian Alburo, and of course, our distinguished guests and friends, Dr. Jerry Sikat and Dr. Ernie Pernia. So we have a very good, very distinguished attendees to this afternoon's forum. We also have the presence of our co-sponsors, the Ayala Partners and the Ayala Group of Companies, and of course those coming from the Philippine Economic Society, USAID, Ateneo de Manila, UP School of Economics, and many others. We are actually today having over 150 participants in this forum, and we have more than 200 participants in the Zoom meeting. Thank you for joining us online, and we hope you can keep active and participate with questions and comments using our chat box. Today's seminar is part of a long-standing series of economic discussions sponsored by the UP School of Economics with the Ayala Group of Companies. And an interesting side note to this series is that in 2006, the UP School of Economics, in partnership with the PDE graduate students, UPSE Alumni Association, and the Philippine Economic Society, first hosted a national lecture entitled Can national policies really raise economic growth? The lecture was one of the school's most successful events, prompting deep discussions and exchanges among key players in the industry. Today, we are honored to welcome Dr. William Easterly, the man who was responsible for this lecture and responsible for that success 17 years ago, to this same hall. We hope that the presentations today and the comments and discussions of our discussants will also provoke the same lively debate and discourse. But to further tell you about Dr. Easterly, let me call on Noel de Dios, Professor Emeritus of the UP School of Economics.
Dear colleagues, friends, and guests, it's truly a great pleasure to introduce Professor William Bill Easterly. Professor Easterly was born in West Virginia and grew up in Bowling Green, Ohio. He received his BA from Bowling Green State University and his PhD from MIT. He is currently Professor of Economics at New York University, where he co-directs the NYU Development Research Institute. He's a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research. In 2008 and 2009, Foreign Policy magazine named him among the top 100 global public intellectuals. Bit of local color, he's also the 14th most famous native of Bowling Green, Ohio. But those who work in the field of development economics and institutional economics will find no need for an introduction and will realize what a privilege it is to see and listen to him in the flesh. For Professor Easterly's work represents indispensable source reading for scholars of institutions and development, economic history, and, in my view, even the first course in introductory economics, where I have included certain chapters of his book, The White Man's Burden, to be read by undergraduates with no exposure to economics beforehand. That book, by the way, won the Hayek Award from the Manhattan Institute and is one of 3 books he has written, the other being the earlier Elusive Quest for Growth, 2001, and the later Tyranny of Experts, 2014. In the area of theory, Easterly is a major voice in that fascinating field associated with Acemoglu, Johnson, and Robinson, which seeks to examine how past historical, even ancient facts and circumstances play a role in explaining the current level of development of many developing countries, as mediated by the types of institutions they have established. Easterly's work has reinforced the view that countries favored by historical circumstances to have established political institutions of democracy and structures of equality have done well in terms of economic performance up to the present day. Though it must be admitted that this historical and empirical fact takes nothing away from the criticism that it fails to account for the violent and exclusionary policies against subject peoples associated with colonial legacies. In the policy arena, especially in his books, Professor Easterly is best recognized for his critique of the long-held and widespread notion that foreign aid, especially in the way it is currently conceived and administered by bilateral and multilateral agencies, is in any way a panacea or even a main driving force for the relief of poverty in developing countries. Against the implicit paternalism and messianic complex implicit in the work of aid agencies, Easterly underscores the importance of the agency of the people themselves who want to be helped. Consistent with the results of his theoretical work, he regards the empowerment of the poor, their own agency in both economic and political terms, as the essential ingredient for them to reach their potential. He shows that the top-down approach and the failure of aid agencies to fully take the real needs and wishes of the poor into account, that's the reason for the many documented debacles of foreign aid over many decades. Nor do his observations regarding the motivations and consequences of external aid come from an outside or armchair perspective. He worked at the World Bank for a decade and a half as economist and senior advisor at the Macroeconomics and Growth Division, so his writings may be likened to that of a whistleblower. His skepticism over external assistance is so passionate, he has not shied away from debate, notably the very prominent and extended public debate with his equally well-known economic antagonist, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. The urgency of recognizing the problem motivates Professor Easterly not to mince words or to be politic in his books. He uses terms like gangsters to refer to corrupt authoritarian regimes that aid agencies cavort with, manages to attach negative connotations to words such as planners and bureaucrats, and he labels as utopian people like Sachs and Bono, who continue to hold the illusion that externally determined funding and top-down priorities agreed between unaccountable governments and aid agencies will make a dent somehow in resolving the myriad everyday problems faced by real people. As for the Philippines, the description of Professor Easterly is East Asia's main disappointment. Thanks, Bill. Without preempting Professor Easterly's lecture this afternoon, but summarizing what I think is the spirit of his viewpoint and advocacy, I recall to you a quote from the film Chariots of Fire. I don't know if any of you remember that, where the character Eric Liddell, a 100-meter Olympic runner and China missionary, delivers a sermon and finally asks and answers his own question, which is, and where does the power come from to see the race to the end? From within. Colleagues, friends, and guests, I present to you Professor William Easterly.
Thank you, Professor De Dios, for those kind words. I don't remember saying Philippines is disappointment of East Asia. I will challenge that until you find the exact quote. So I'm talking to you today about the paradox of foreign aid and how it's affected by donor self-interest. So let me give you an outline of where we're going this afternoon. The paradox of aid is when donors targeting the needs of the poor accidentally target bad institutions and therefore wind up with ineffective aid. The donors have a way of coping with this, which previous academic literature and policy debates suggest, is that the donors can select on good institutions conditional on the amount of poverty. And that is a way of mitigating and reducing the paradox of aid in which aid would go to countries with bad institutions. And the traditional literature has seen any departure from this optimal behavior as reflecting self-interest. Well, we need look no farther than recent history to see this happening in practice. This paper is going to look to the history of 9/11, 2001, as a shock to U.S. self-interest that then affected in the wrong direction, the paradox of aid. So let's start with the sort of obvious ideas first, that aid tends to work with in the presence of good policies and institutions. It doesn't work in the presence of poor policies and institutions. This is an idea that was popularized even more around 2000, right before the break in aid that we're going to talk about today, when an article by Burnside and Dollar said that they found that aid has a positive impact on growth in developing countries with good fiscal, monetary, and trade policies, but has little effect in the presence of poor policies. So this research did not actually get confirmed later as that aid really did have a positive effect on growth, even in the presence of good policies and institutions. It failed a replication test that I was involved in. But what's important for our purposes is that the intuition that aid works better when it goes to a country with good policies and institutions was widely accepted, including by most of us who work in development. The intuition that aid would work worse with bad policies was indeed widely accepted. So what's most important for our purposes is that the donors themselves believe this. The best evidence on aid effectiveness is probably the literature on violence, that in the presence of violence such as civil war, coups, and terrorism, aid is less likely to work. That idea was first promoted by a classic article by Nathan Nunn and Nancy Chan called U.S. Food Aid and Civil Conflict, where using a clever empirical strategy, they found that food aid from the U.S. had a negative causal effect on conflict in the recipient country. It tended to make conflict worse in the recipient country. And they appealed to the intuition that food aid, as documented by some examples in Somalia and other places in Afghanistan, that food aid tends to get captured by local warlords who are then able to use the food aid to pay for more soldiers and guns. This research was further amplified by other studies, and by 2017 there was a good survey of all of these studies that found that aid in conflict zones is more likely to exacerbate violence than to dampen violence. So aid could actually have a negative effect in the presence of violence to make violence even worse. And appealing to the same intuition, this author suggested that a violence increasing effect occurs when the aid is misappropriated by the violent actors, or when violent actors can sabotage aid projects to prevent the cooperation between the population and the government. One very tragic example of this was that there were something like 253 aid workers that were killed during the war in Afghanistan. This is reflecting the tragic way in which local violent actors tried to sabotage the aid effort in Afghanistan. So this is the tragic way in which aid really is operating under really difficult circumstances in a violent environment. Now, other authors are more positive about the potential for doing something good in a violent environment in the middle of war. This great book that got published recently by Chris Blattman suggested that there are a number of micro projects that can work to do good things in the presence of conflict and could even help move towards resolving conflicts. These micro projects were evaluated systematically and rigorously with randomized controlled trials, but did not really answer the big question on whether an aid flow in the country as a whole would worsen or improve violence. So again, the most important thing that about aid effectiveness is what the donors themselves believe about aid effectiveness. So here is one individual who had strong feelings about where aid works. That's a guy named George W. Bush, who played some role in the events around 2001, 2002. Bush argued that money that is not accompanied by legal and economic reform is oftentimes wasted. In many poor nations, corruption runs deep. Private property is unprotected. Private contracts are unenforceable. Progress against poverty is nearly impossible. More aid money can actually be counterproductive. And so Bush suggested that USAID should go to these countries that live by these three broad standards: ruling justly, investing in their people, and encouraging economic freedom. That Bush announced those would be the countries that received more aid from America. Well, what made what made Bush's task very difficult to give aid to countries that are ruling justly is this problem called the paradox of aid. The paradox of aid was first stated by the great development economist P.T. Bauer in the 1960s and 70s. More recently, it's been stated by another great development economist, the Nobel laureate Angus Deaton. And to reduce it to its simplest terms, the paradox of aid is just this: that where aid is needed, it does not work. Where aid works, it is not needed. So again, the paradox is where aid is needed, it does not work. Where aid works, it is not needed. So Bush's problem is that he wants to give aid to where it's needed, but those are the places that have that lack the institutions such as ruling justly, et cetera. The places that do have those institutions such as ruling justly, et cetera, those are the places that are richer and don't need the aid. That is the paradox of aid. So we can think of the more precise definition of the aid paradox is that there's a strong correlation among aid recipients between one variable measuring need for aid, another variable measuring effectiveness of aid. So need is high where effectiveness is low. Effectiveness is high where need is low. And so when donors target high need, they accidentally target low effectiveness. So a need variable might be something like per capita income of the country receiving the aid. A common effectiveness measure is quality of institutions in the country receiving the aid, which also includes measures of some policies. So we could kind of lump together policies and institutions. They usually go together, good economic policy management and good quality institutions. So the problem is that high per capita income is associated with good policies and institutions. Those countries don't need the aid. Low per capita income has high need, but is associated with poor quality institutions and policies. So at this point right here, we have some options at this point. We could just throw up our hands and say it's hopeless, aid cannot work, there's a paradox. Where aid is needed, it doesn't work, it's hopeless, let's all just go home. So I could just walk away and go home, and we could end the lecture and just say, let's not do any more aid, and it would all be over. But actually, let me try to be a little bit more constructive than that. I don't think that's a very constructive contribution. So what I think the donors argue, and which I find very persuasive, is that the option for the donors is that they could lessen the paradox by redirecting aid towards countries with the highest effectiveness possible, conditional on need. So if you condition on need, among the set of needy countries that do need the aid, you try to select recipients that have the best quality institutions. And that is exactly the point that everyone seems to agree on at this point. This is the consensus on how to most effectively achieve poverty reduction, is to target both poverty and institutional quality. Or in other words, to target institutional quality conditional on poverty. And so the extent to which donors follow that advice could be a good measure of how altruistic is each donor, or the absence of following that advice or doing the opposite of that advice we could attribute to self-interest. So that's exactly what the donors themselves seem to agree on. Here's another quote from Collier and Dollar, which was another influential article about this time. The reason articles from this time are of particular interest is exactly the time at which I want to study that there was a break in aid behavior around 2001, which I'll get to in a couple of slides. So Collier and Dollar agreed to maximize the reduction in poverty. Aid should be allocated to countries that have large amounts of poverty, and good policy. And these principles were affirmed in numerous aid declarations by donors on good practices. The World Bank, in its classic report on aid that had been done a couple of years earlier, has suggested the departure from this optimal aid behavior is precisely because of donor self-interest, such as international politics. So the bank in this paragraph concluded that between 1970 and 1993, aid allocations were dominated by politics, such as the politics of the Cold War, and therefore aid did not follow this. Aid tended to go to corrupt autocrats and did not follow this optimal policy. So to put things in more precise terms, let's look at some data on need and effectiveness. So on the horizontal axis here is a measure of need of initial per capita income. And then on the vertical axis is one of the World Bank's governance indicators. This one is called political stability and freedom from violence and terrorism. So here, an increase on the vertical axis means less violence, more political stability, and a decrease on the vertical axis in a negative direction means more violence, less political stability. And then each data point here is a country, averaged over 2002 to 2019, their average governance score and their initial per capita income. So here the orange circle that I put above the line is what the advice on giving aid to countries with good institutional conditional on need would mean. So you start with selecting a group of countries on the left-hand side of the graph that have low initial per capita income as measured by the horizontal axis. And for that set of countries, you try to find those countries that have as good as possible institutions according to this measure, and you select that group of countries to be the recipients of your aid. What you don't want to do is give aid to the countries with the worst institutions conditional on poverty. That would be self-defeating. The aid would not be effective if it was going to countries with the worst institutions out of that set. And so in that group, we would have countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Sudan. For those of you who know three-letter World Bank country codes, you can read these. Colombia, Lebanon, Iraq, Yemen, Nigeria, Central African Republic, Congo, etc. Sorry? Uh-oh. See? I don't know. It just happens by accident. I'm not even conscious of it. We have to fix this. Can you help me fix it afterwards? Wow. Wow. That's why I wasn't invited back for 14 years. Okay. Let me try to recover my dignity here. So at this point, it's pretty clear what my advice is as to where you should give aid. So what do you guess about whether the U.S. administration is going to follow my advice or not? You think they're going to follow my advice? Let's see. Here we are with the same graph. Now we have little red X's for the top. The little red X's are the countries that are in the top 25% of U.S. aid recipients. That is, top 25% sorted by those who get the most aid. Don't mention the Philippines. And so you can see this group includes a lot of countries that, in fact, were in the top U.S. aid recipients in this graph were in the group that I told USAID not to give money to in the previous graph. So USAID is not following the advice. They, in fact, seem to be doing the exact opposite of my advice, giving aid to the countries that are way below the line on the institutional quality for a given amount of need. So the result of this is that the result of not fighting the paradox, but sort of making the paradox worse, is that USAID tends to go even more to the countries experiencing the most violence. Again, so here now I have the violence and political stability indicator on the horizontal axis. So movement to the right in the positive direction means less violence. Movement to the left in the negative direction means more violence and political instability. And on the vertical axis is the logarithm of U.S. aid receipts by country. So these are averages over 2002 to 2019. And so what you see is that the more violence and the less political stability a country has, the more likely it is to get large amounts of U.S. aid. So the slope of this line being so strong is a consequence of what happened in the previous graph, that the U.S. aid could have tried to mitigate the paradox by giving aid to countries with better institutional quality, but did the opposite, and so the relationship between institutional quality and aid became even worse, making the paradox of aid even worse, making aid even less likely to work in countries receiving U.S. aid. And violence is also correlated with other measures of good governance. So the World Bank has 5 other measures of good governance. I took the average of all of them. So that includes things like voice and accountability, regulatory quality, rule of law, freedom from corruption, all those indicators on average. Again, the U.S. aid winds up going to countries with the worst governance because of the way in which the paradox of aid got worse by U.S. aid behavior. So where did this aid behavior in the U.S. come from? So it's not appropriate for economists just to say, you know, you guys are morally wrong or something. There must be some good reason, some interest at stake that causes this behavior. And so there's a very plausible event that caused this behavior, and that was the terrorist attack on September 11, 2001, which marked a very sudden change in U.S. national security needs. And there was not any sudden change at the same time in the needs of low-income countries, so it seems likely that any change that we see happening abruptly around 2001 had a lot to do with this, with the increase, with a shift in the self-interest of the U.S. And in fact, we know from quotes that I'm going to give you in a second that the national security did choose to use aid as a tool and set a high priority on aid to countries in conflicts that were called at the time failed states or fragile situations. There was no abrupt change in poverty worldwide and no abrupt change in global poverty. So just on global poverty, just to tell you the extremely obvious, there's been a long-run trend in world poverty. This is a graph that shows the total number of people in the world that are in extreme poverty and are not in extreme poverty. So in the red area is those that are in extreme poverty, and that the number of people in extreme poverty has trended down over time, and there was no sudden break around 2001. And then the other thing is that there was no sudden break in violence around 2001. Of course, 2001 itself was a very violent event, but as far as violence in developing countries, there was no sudden change in violence around 2001. In fact, if anything, the spike that you see in 1999, 1998, 99, this spike over here, you see this spike over here happening just before 2001. And that spike was the Eritrea. That spike in 1999 to 2000 was the Ethiopia-Eritrea war. But then after that war was over, there was actually a shift down in conflict worldwide. So there was no sort of sudden need to prioritize conflict as a problem any more than there had been before. I mean, conflict is a very tragic problem, but there was no sudden change in the need to address conflict. And that conflict stayed at a low level from 2001 to 2011, and then there was a shift in conflict upward that was associated with the Arab Spring around 2012, and then of course continuing more recently with conflict between Ukraine and Russia. So Bush, at the same time that he had been announcing that he wanted to give more aid to countries with good institutions, he was also announcing that he was going to use aid as a tool in the war on terror. Bush said the aid would help fix what he called failed governments. Bush announced an increase in the U.S. foreign aid budget by 50% at the beginning of 2002, which was clearly motivated by 9/11, and emphasized aid to countries in conflict, which also had other poor institutions. One way to see how this happened is to look what happened in Africa. In Africa, there was a U.S. military new command called AFRICOM. For the first time, the U.S. military had an Africa command. The AFRICOM website lists governments who are cooperating with the U.S. against terrorism. So we know who the allies in Africa were against terrorism. And together, the African allies received a 157% increase in annual development aid. So it's not a big mystery of what's going on here. The allies are getting a very large increase in aid. The overall aid budget over this time is also increasing, but only by something like 70%, while the African allies in the war on terror are getting a 157% increase in annual development aid. Now, not every one of these allies has terrible governance, but on average, the average ranking of African allies was the 36th percentile on our measure of government, so they were close to being in the worst third of the world on governance. And some examples of allies that had pretty bad governance were Burundi, the Central African Republic, Chad, Ethiopia, and these are listed on the U.S. Africa Command website. So the prediction, what we might expect to happen here based on an idea that donors do operate under some form of self-interest, is that that self-interest will cause the U.S. aid to shift away from the optimal aid allocation needed to reduce poverty, and will shift more, and we might expect U.S. aid to shift more than other donors' aid does. So here's a graph that's some hint of the break that is happening around 2001. So in this graph, every data point is a correlation between governance and aid in that year. So the strength of the negative correlation is how much aid tends to go to countries with the worst governance. So for the US, the blue line starts at about minus 0.2 around 1998. And it's not completely clean, as data never is, but you do notice there's sort of a sudden sloping downward that happens after 2001. That it goes from somewhere around minus 0.2, minus 0.3 negative correlation between governance and US aid. And then by 2010, it's getting down to minus 0.6 correlation. So by the years of the new millennium, US aid is a lot more likely to go to countries with bad governance than it was before. The pattern with all donors here you don't see as pronounced. Then in the next graph, we look specifically at the correlation of aid with the political stability, absence of violence indicator, or again, a negative correlation here means the extent to which aid goes to countries with the most violence. So we see this shift happening again around 2001, and here it happens for both US and all donors at the same time. The correlation becomes much more negative. So it becomes much more true than before, after 2001, that US aid tends to go to countries with the most violence. So here's an equation that we can use to try to sort this out. I think for lack of time, I won't go through all the details of the equation, and we'll just discuss intuitively what the coefficients will mean. So the coefficients that I want to estimate is I'm interested first in how much negative selection there was on effectiveness already before 9/11. I'm going to call that period 1. How much was it already true before 2001 that the US aid went to countries with bad governance? And then test the shift that happens after 2001. Does the coefficient become even more negative? Does it become even more true that aid shifts towards countries with bad governance? And then I'll test the difference between the US behavior and all donors' behavior. The governance that I'm going to look at, I'm going to measure with, again, the World Bank's governance indicators, which I'm always reminded are not supposed to be called the World Bank's governance indicators because they might be controversial. The World Bank calls them the World of something, something, something governance indicators, but I can never remember what the something, something, something is. It's officially done by somebody not affiliated with the World Bank, which is staffed by present or former World Bank staff. So the data is from the US aid is from the standard sources, donors aid is from the World Bank World Development Indicators. I'm also going to look at measures of need, which are from the World Bank Development Indicators, GDP per capita and population. And the data from, here's what it's called, I forgot, Worldwide Governance Indicators. The dimensions are voice and accountability, political stability and absence of violence and terrorism. That's the one I've already talked about and shown you some data on. Government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, control of corruption. The governance data are available for these years, so I only have 4 years before 9/11 to measure governance, which is, I'll take the average from 1996 to 2000 on governance, and then take the average after 9/11 from 2002 to 2019 to measure the aid allocation before and after 9/11. So, my wife's cell phone is ringing. Is that USAID calling? So got it, okay. So the unconditional selection on institutions is what in the end determines effectiveness of aid. So we want to know, to what extent is it still true that aid tends to go to countries with the worst institutions? That's the first thing we're interested in. But then we want to know also what happens to the selection on institutions conditional on need to measure sort of the effort that the donor is making to try to make institutional quality as good as possible, conditional on giving aid to countries that are in need of the aid. So let's look first at the one that just measures to what extent is it true that aid just goes to countries with bad governance. So here is a super confusing table that I don't really I'm not really expecting full comprehension of this because I have not invested enough effort in explaining it. I'm just going to walk you through what the coefficients mean. So in the color coding scheme, which I invented by myself with lots of artistic inspiration, was that yellow means a highly significant result, significant at the 5% level or better. The blue means significant at 10%, so it's kind of blue is sort of a weak result, and yellow is a strong result. In the first row here, I'm going to, so each column here represents one regression where the dependent variable will be the log of US aid regressed on some governance indicator. And the governance indicator in each column is the one listed at the head of the column. So in the first column, I'm regressing the log of US aid on the governance indicator, political stability and absence of violence. And the first coefficient in the column represents the pre-9/11 relationship between governance and aid. So it's, as I've already shown you from the figures that I showed earlier, there is already before 9/11 a strong negative correlation between governance and receiving US aid. And then the second coefficient, the minus 0.727 in the first column in the second row, is the extent to which the coefficient shifted after 9/11. So the way to read this in the first column is already before 9/11, there was a 1 standard deviation increase in political stability and absence of violence and terrorism would have reduced US aid by minus 0.855. But then after 9/11, that coefficient got even more negative by 0.727. So that's the confirmation that yes, there was a shift after 9/11, such that if you thought if there was already negative selection before 9/11, there was even more negative selection on giving aid to the worst governed countries after 9/11, as measured here by political stability and absence of violence. And then the other columns show to what extent there was a shift on other dimensions of governance, such as corruption, government effectiveness, etc. And here the results are much less strong on the other governance indicators. So it looked like the one that really got a lot worse with the US behavior of US aid is the one on violence. There's some of these blue weak results of a shift on rule of law and voice and accountability, that those coefficients also got worse, but the significance is not as strong at the 10% level. So the thing you need to know is this is a big effect. So the meaning of the minus 0.727 coefficient in the second row, first column, is that a 1 standard deviation increase in violence leads to additional log increase of aid after 2001 of 0.727, which is a 107% increase. So a 1 standard deviation increase in violence leads to 107% more US aid to that country. That's a very strong effect of increasing aid from the less violent to the more violent situations. And then here is the same exercise, for not for USAID, but for all donors. So for all donors, the first row shows you how much all donors were responding to governance and allocating the aid before 9/11. So remember, each of these regressions is a regression of aid received by the recipient country as determined by the average institutional quality of the recipient country. So how much was it the case that aid tended to go towards recipient countries with worse institutions as measured by these variables? And so what you see is that already before 9/11, there was already a very strong negative relationship, that aid went to more countries with bad governance. But then after 9/11, in the second row of this table is the shift on all of these dimensions, such that aid went even more to countries with worse governance after 9/11. And what frankly surprised me, and this is going to be a surprise I never quite resolve in this talk, is that where I thought it was going to be only the behavior of the US aid that was going to be going to countries with bad governance and worsening the paradox of aid because of 9/11, it actually turned out that all the donors were behaving on average this way. They were all shifting aid towards more countries with bad governance measured by these indicators. So, and that's what the figures in the second row of the table is showing. So for example, in the first column, I'm regressing the log of all donors' aid on political stability and absence of violence. So minus 0.785 is how much it responded to violence before 9/11. Then in the second row, minus 0.583 is how much the coefficient got even more negative after 2001. So for all donors are also shifting even more strongly than the US did, shifting aid to countries where such that aid is going to more countries with bad governance after 9/11. So this is the main result so far, is just the US did have a negative shift on political stability and absence of violence. And contrary to expectations, all donors have more significant shifts on most dimensions of governance. Then the next exercise is, now we're going to test whether donors are trying to mitigate the paradox as much as they can by selecting on countries that have the best institutions conditional on need. So what we're looking for is the kind of behavior that we were talking about in the graph earlier. Going back to this graph, to what extent were the donors conditional on need, conditional on initial per capita income? To what extent were the donors giving aid to countries with good institutions versus aid to countries with bad institutions? So what we're going to see here is that conditional on need, we now do the table again. So there's some good news and bad news here. The first row shows what was happening to US aid before 9/11. How much was US aid responding to good governance before 9/11? Remember this, we only have governance data for the period 1996 to 2000. So when I say before 9/11, this was not actually the period covered by the Cold War. It was covered by a sort of interregnum between the Cold War and the War on Terror, in which it looked like in the first row, we see actually US aid is responding positively to governance conditional on need. So before 2001, US aid was actually doing what it was supposed to do: select as much as possible on good institutions for a given amount of need, give more aid to those countries with good institutions conditional on need. You would still have some paradox of aid because the needy countries do have worse institutions than less needy countries. But you would be doing as well as you could by selecting the countries that had the best institutions conditional on need. That would tend to mitigate the paradox. So that's what we see actually happening on regulatory quality, voice and accountability, and the average of all the governance variables before 9/11 as seen in the first row. Then in the second row is the shift. So the second row is the shift on how much US aid now shifted away from the good advice, away from the optimal allocation to reduce poverty, and shifted in the direction of giving more aid to countries with worse institutions. So we see in the second row that there was more U.S. aid, the shift resulted in more U.S. aid going to more politically unstable places, more corrupt places, less government effectiveness places, less regulatory quality places, less rule of law places, less voice and accountability places, less average of all governance variables places. So this is the main result of this presentation today, is just how much there was a big shift away from the optimal aid allocation for poverty reduction. And this is what seems to be the sad consequence of the understandable political self-interest the U.S. felt after 9/11 to prioritize the war on terror over development. But the result was that aid was shifting to places where it was going to be less effective at reducing poverty. And then once again, I was surprised how much this was not only a result for the U.S., but actually even a stronger result for all donors. So, and for all donors, it's also true for them that before 2001, in the first row, we see them having a positive coefficient on governance for regulatory quality, rule of law, voice and accountability, the average of all the governance variables. And then in the second row, we see the shift that happened in that coefficient after 2001. So after 2001, all donors shifted in the direction of giving more aid conditional on need to the worst situations as far as political stability, corruption, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, voice and accountability, all of the above. So the end of the story, the main point of the story and most of the end of the story is that both U.S. and all donors had been doing the right thing before 2001. After 2001, both shifted away from positive selection on governance towards worse governed places where aid would be less effective at achieving the goal of worldwide poverty reduction. Now, I want to be careful on making sure this result really holds up. So one thing some of you might be wondering, and I was wondering as I was working on this, is maybe this is just about Afghanistan and Iraq. So obviously huge amounts of US aid, and to a lesser extent all donors' aid, went into Afghanistan and Iraq. Those Afghanistan and Iraq are outstanding examples of having environments where there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of corruption, there's not much voice and accountability, there's not much good governance going on in general. And there's a lot of US aid and other donor aid going into those two places. Maybe this was all just about, maybe it was only Afghanistan and Iraq that were driving these results. Now, of course, Afghanistan and Iraq do count. You don't get to just erase them and say that doesn't count. They do count. So they are an example of how the agenda for poverty reduction kind of took second place to some other big objectives that had a lot to do with the war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq. That counts. But we still might want to know if this behavior was also true outside of those two cases. So let's do a little bit of testing what happens to these results when we omit Afghanistan and Iraq. So we see here we see the same tables that I'm going to do over again. Here we still get, to make a long story short, for US aid in the first column, we're getting US aid on political stability and absence of violence. In the second row of the first column, we still get the main result, that US aid still did shift a lot in response to violence after 2001, even if we exclude Iraq and Afghanistan. So it was also true outside of those two places that US aid is being redirected towards places with political instability and violence. And then in the second table, we have the result for the all donors aid. It's also true for them that there's a shift on violence, and they have some weaker results in other governance areas. For the selection of aid on governance, conditional on need in this table, it's still true that there's some shift in the coefficients away from the optimal policy after 2001, as shown by the the blue and the yellow highlighted negative coefficients in the second row. The results are not as strong as it was with Afghanistan and Iraq. So Afghanistan and Iraq did have something to do with the very strong results in the first set of tables. But here is kind of the result that I found most striking and strong and robust, which surprisingly to me turned out to be the behavior of all donors and not just the US, that all donors on average were shifting in the second row almost universally towards, even excluding Afghanistan and Iraq, were shifting almost universally towards countries with worst governance. And this was true especially of political stability and absence of violence, as usual. It was also true of voice and accountability, that aid was shifting towards countries with less democratic regimes. And it was, if we take the average of all the governance variables except the political stability one, all aid donors' aid is shifting in the direction of countries with worse governance after 2001. So the big surprise that I found in this exercise was just that the difference that I expected to exist between the US and other donors did not really exist. There actually was no difference in the behavior of the US and other donors. So testing that there was any difference between them, I always found there was no evidence of any difference between them and their behavior. So let me reach quickly to the conclusions here. So we confirm the prediction that a major shock to self-interest does lead to donors to behave in a way that is counterproductive, moving them away from the optimal behavior, actually worsening the paradox of aid, making them shift aid into places where aid is likely to be less effective at reducing poverty. This was true both of the US and all donors. And in the end, what we find is the paradox of aid was even more of a severe problem in 2002 to 2019 than before. Donors not only failed to follow the recommended optimal policy of positively selecting on governance relative to need, they were moving in the opposite direction. So the puzzle that I'm left with at the end is, why did all donors move more towards an even worse paradox of aid? Perhaps other donors that are in this database, mainly rich Western bilateral donors, maybe the other donors also saw 9/11 as affecting their self-interest in the same direction that the US did. Then the more intriguing one that I thought of and that other people suggested also is that maybe the aid ideas changed after 9/11 to redefine violence itself as the need, which is kind of obvious that violence itself creates a situation of acute need, of people acutely in need of aid. So we could think that maybe that is what is going on. Now there's a couple problems with that story. One is that, as I showed you in that violence graph earlier, there was no sudden change in violence. So there was no obvious reason why the donors' behavior shifted abruptly after 2001 when there was no worldwide change in violence. The other problem with it, and this is not a problem, and you're totally welcome to define violence as need if you want to, and it's very understandable. If you do that, you have an even worse paradox. It's even harder to get out of the paradox of aid, because now you have exactly the same variable measuring both need and effectiveness. If violence measures need, that's where the need is, but then violence, according to all that research I mentioned earlier, is also the place where the effectiveness is likely to be the lowest. So now you do have an almost totally intransigent paradox of aid if violence is both need and effectiveness measure. The last possibility is donors could see countries with poor governance as those that are in need of aid to fix the governance so that the governance will get better. That's another kind of appealing and understandable humanitarian impulse. Unfortunately, there is no evidence that aid makes governance better, and there is some evidence that aid makes governance worse. The last possibility is maybe some of the humanitarian advocates of more aid for world poverty were kind of happy to accept this, not happy, but kind of were willing to accept the trade-off that because of what happened on 9/11/2001, there would be a lot more aid available to fight poverty in the world. And maybe accepting that bargain that there would be more aid available, even if the aid shifted in the direction of less effectiveness, maybe that was a bargain worth having. But where we're left with is in a world after 2001 that made it even more difficult to achieve poverty reduction worldwide with aid, because it made the paradox of aid even worse, that where aid works, it is not needed, and where aid is needed, it does not work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Easterly. I mean, as expected, you have raised serious, troubling questions on the effectiveness of aid and, of course, throwing the challenge to our donor community. We have this afternoon 3 members of our panel who are very familiar with aid programs and various forms of aid, and let me introduce them to you. The first is Mr. Ryan Washburn. Ryan Washburn is the Mission Director of USAID, or the Agency for International Development, who currently oversees bilateral foreign assistance in the Philippines, the Pacific Islands, and Mongolia. Previously, he was the USAID Mission Director to Indonesia and Principal Officer to the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. And during his 20-year career or more with USAID, Ryan has worked as well in Africa, in Zambia, Rwanda, Ghana, Mali, and also at headquarters in Washington, D.C. Our second discussant is Dr. Joseph Sviglish, and he brings to this table, or to this panel, the multilateral bank's perspectives on aid and development assistance. As Deputy Chief Economist of the Asian Development Bank, he sets research directions for the Economic Research and Regional Cooperation Department. He ensures the quality of research and as well as briefs the ADB board and management of emerging economic issues. Dr. Florian Alburo, Professor Emeritus of the UP School of Economics, has over 2 decades of professional and managerial experience on international trade and finance, investment and development policy administration. He brings to the panel the perspectives, I hope, of the recipient countries, drawing largely from his very strong experience as an academic, as a senior government policymaker, project director of programs and projects, leader of consulting teams, and independent consultant to international organizations and the private sector. May I call on Mr. Ryan Washburn to start the panel.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon, and thank you, Dr. Easterly, for your presentation. The U.S. Agency for International Development, or USAID, is the lead U.S. government agency that provides development and humanitarian assistance around the world. We work to reduce global poverty, strengthen democratic governance, and support more than 100 partner countries on their path to sustainable development. All right. I'm the USAID Mission Director for the Philippines, Pacific Islands, Mongolia, and I just want to be clear from the start that I do not speak for the agency as a whole, that my remarks are attributed to me alone. Let me first speak to the issue of self-interest. As with all international development organizations, USAID strives for efficiency, effectiveness, and meaningful results. Our very tagline, "From the American People," mandates that we be accountable for our work and uphold the highest standards of integrity. Yet our agency also reflects the values of the American people, and one of these values is compassion. We don't apologize for targeting our aid where the need is greatest. Our primary objective is not return on investment. when children are hungry, I think our sense of duty binds us to help feed them. When democracies are under attack, it's our responsibility to help communities fight for their inalienable rights. When typhoons, floods, and disasters wreak havoc on communities, we partner with them to build back their lives and livelihoods. In fact, USAID has responded to more than 50 natural disasters here in the Philippines since 1990, providing life-saving emergency assistance while strengthening the government's capacity to prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. The USAID Administrator Samantha Powers says it best. It is in America's best interest to help feed the world, to help protect fellow democracies, to advocate for the dignity of all people, not only to reflect an America that is generous, compassionate, and moral, but also to protect the safety and prosperity of the American people. Next, I'd like to look at the composition of U.S. foreign assistance using the same data found on the publicly available foreignassistance.gov website, and let's exclude military assistance. For about 30 years, from 1970 to 2000, U.S. foreign assistance averaged about $20 billion a year in constant dollars. Then, in about 2003, it jumped to an average of 35 and now almost $50 billion a year. So where did all this additional $15+ billion a year aid money go in the past 2 decades? So after 9/11, looking at 2003 to 2013, the United States rapidly expanded assistance by about $6 billion a year to conflict-affected areas like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iraq. Our assistance was not driven by effectiveness as a primary factor. It was ramped up in countries impacted by the aftermath of September 11th because doing so was a humanitarian and foreign policy imperative for the United States. But I conject that that's less than half the story. A similar sized increase, in the orange on the slide if you can see, about $6 billion a year occurred across Africa and countries deeply impacted by the exploding HIV/AIDS crisis. In the late 1990s, life expectancies dropped by about 2 decades in countries hardest hit by the HIV/AIDS pandemic. In response, U.S. foreign assistance surged with the advent of President Bush's President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, in 2003. The United States allocated funding to where it was needed most to save lives. Through HIV/AIDS prevention, care, and treatment, U.S. foreign assistance has helped stabilize the epidemic and reduced AIDS-related deaths by 68% since the peak in 2004. After investing $100 billion, an estimated 25 million lives have been saved. On a personal note, I was living and working in Zambia in southern Africa at this time, and the U.S. Embassy had to stock coffins in our warehouse because so many staff members perished from the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Life expectancy had plummeted to 43 years at the nadir. Since then, with U.S. and other assistance, prevention measures, antiretroviral drugs have been introduced and now widely adopted. The average Zambian now lives to an expected 65 years. Now let's turn to aid effectiveness. I believe I've outlined the honorable objectives of U.S. foreign assistance, but I agree that good intentions are not enough. It's our responsibility to use taxpayer money in the most effective way possible. Let's take a look at 3 lessons we've learned here from our development work in the Philippines. First lesson is working more with local partners on local priorities and what we call localization. A recent Economist article on this. 2013, we set up the $26 million Philippine American Fund that provided seed grants and training to 38 local organizations. In one example, this support and a successor program helped over 50,000 agricultural co-op members enter into agreements to supply corn at a fixed price. By working with local stakeholders to develop interventions that respond to community priorities and soliciting feedback, we can both support local initiative and maximize our aid effectiveness. Another local organization, the University of the Philippines Public Administration Research and Extension Service Foundation is our primary partner on USAID's Regulatory Support Program for National Development, or RESPOND activity. This activity strengthens regulatory capacity and policy reform, such as support for the country's Anti-Red Tape Authority and the Philippine Competition Commission. Similarly, we've provided grants to our host this afternoon, the UP School of Economics, to advance research and advocacy in the fields of health and energy economics. These efforts have advanced universal access to health care, and in the case of energy, enabled a better understanding of the renewable resources as a part of the country's energy mix. Second lesson we've learned is to focus on inclusion. By adding an inclusive lens to our programming, we can expand both our reach and our impact on the lives of traditionally marginalized. For example, USAID has worked in the education sector, teaching young students to read for decades. Now we're expanding to help children with disabilities. In partnership with Resources for the Blind, a local organization that received a grant from the PhilAm Fund 10 years ago, USAID has trained nearly 900 community health workers to screen children for vision and hearing impairment. This partnership has helped triple the enrollment of blind and deaf learners in 3 provinces. USAID has trained around 800 teachers, distributed Braille and Filipino Sign Language learning materials, and helped parents of children with disabilities teach their children at home. The third lesson we've learned is to constantly assess and evaluate our interventions, learn from what doesn't work, and adapt as we go. For example, in the health sector, we work with local hospitals to increase access to family planning services. While this partnership nearly doubled the number of public hospitals offering family planning, one hospital in Bohol was denied nearly 300 PhilHealth claims worth 3.5 million pesos due to charting and documentation errors. Using a collaborating, learning, and adapting approach, we work with them to figure out what was working, what wasn't, and how to adapt. Ultimately, our assistance led to a reinstatement of PhilHealth claims and increased revenue by almost 60 million pesos, and most importantly, improved the quality of health care. In another example, in the early 1990s, USAID and the Philippine government jointly built a new airport and improved Macar Wharf in General Santos City and upgraded roads in South Cotabato. This helped Gensan become the gateway to southern Mindanao region as the so-called tuna capital of the Philippines. An external impact evaluation showed that each dollar invested by USAID infrastructure returned $2.5 to $4.5 in benefits. We learned that while we were not successful in reducing poverty levels in Mindanao region as a whole, average incomes did increase by more than 1/3 in the communities directly benefiting from the infrastructure projects. Community members said that the USAID-supported infrastructure helped increase farmers' incomes because of easier market access, and that footbridges allowed students to travel more easily to school. We also learned that violence declined significantly as compared to controlled communities. Clan wars, encounters between military and rebel groups, and domestic violence all fell by 1/2 to 2/3. With deliberate attention to local partners and priorities, including the marginalized, and taking a collaborative, learning, and adapting approach to our programs, USAID has improved the effectiveness of our aid. Oh, sorry about that. In closing, I want to share another paradox. The goal of international development is to end the need for it. After countries reach a certain point in their development trajectory, with a strong economic base and robust institutions, local governments, private sector, and civil society can tackle the remaining development challenges. USAID assistance is only effective when we stress local ownership, inclusion, and sustainability. When we as international development professionals work ourselves out of a job, when development aid is no longer needed, that to me is a true measure of aid effectiveness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Washburn. Can I call, one can't really argue with some of the, with increased accountability and local partnership with local organizations and community organizations, Mr. Washburn. Can I now call Dr. Sveglich of the Asian Development Bank to the panel?
Ladies and gentlemen, and first of all, thank you to Professor Easterly for a very thought-provoking presentation. And so my comments are actually some of the thoughts that were provoked by his presentation, rather than to give you a sense of what ADB is doing, in part because I'm from the research department, not the operations side of it. But also, I think the basic points that you're raising are really quite fundamental, not to specific programs that the bank, World Bank, or bilateral donors are doing, but more the idea of really more of an existential question that we get at from the aid departments. And it all centers around the idea of what is the objective function? What exactly are we optimizing as an institution? And it was quite compelling, this shift that you've seen after 9/11 towards whatever the traditional focus might have been, towards very much a strong shift towards supporting anti-terrorism. I suppose if we had the data that went back further, you could kind of do this exercise in the Cold War era to think about what would be the directions of the objective function. It would be an anti-communism sort of stance that we might take. It would be very interesting to see whether that break after the fall of the Berlin Wall had led to any improvement in aid in that period. Unfortunately, the data doesn't allow it. But it did make me think about, what does the data allow, this very short time span that we have. First, we have a very small period of time that is our pre-period. And that's really just 3 years of data on these governance indicators, which is a bit unfortunate because they may have been unusual years. And if I'm thinking about it as an economist, it's just, am I finding the shift that's coming from that move to the objective functions to anti-terrorism, or is my comparison point the one that's creating the problems? I think in Professor Easterly's presentation, he makes a very strong case for that it was that unusual break that is there. But one area where we might be able to think about it is, what other things could be done with the data that was there? And here I really found the comparison without Afghanistan and Iraq quite eye-opening. Because it was something where if you pulled out the most obvious flows of aids towards anti-terrorism, we're still getting the same results. That robustness test itself made it very compelling. But it made me also think that suppose we were to look at that long span that we have between 2002 and 2019 and just arbitrarily chose a point to break where we aren't expecting any change in the objective function. We should then see that there is no change in the aid program. Otherwise, it does sort of bring into question, is that such a shift that was happening because of the 9/11? My guess is, just looking at the data, it probably continues to provide a robustness test that will stand up and say, yes, it was in fact a very strong shift in the way that the objectives were being done. I found it, just as a question of interest or probably self-interest, what I was seeing in terms of the comparison between the U.S. And all aid, I was questioning why was it U.S. and not everybody else but the U.S., rather than lumping in the U.S. in there as well. That one was a bit confusing because it does sort of taint the idea that the other donors were coming around. In particular, I really would like to see a question of, is there a difference between multilateral assistance versus bilateral assistance? We would be expecting, at least in principle, that having a board of directors, board of governors that are of a much more diverse makeup, that the shift in objectives would be different. I have a feeling that the results may not be all that different, and that itself would be sort of compelling, because it starts to bring into the question of what exactly is the role of the governance of these multilateral development banks if they look very much like the aid programs of bilateral organizations. So I just add that as something that I think would be interesting to pursue further. Getting to just at this idea of the objective function, what are we optimizing? Professor Easterly, back in 2006, when he was in the Philippines, had also come to ADB, and one part of the talk was really that we had shifted from this much more focused world where we were looking at poverty reduction in terms of the MDGs to the SDGs, which were much broader and putting a lot of onus on countries in terms of the number of indicators that we're looking at and the complexity that it was bringing to the problem. And yet, in fact, this idea that this is all just part of the discussion, but really what was driving it was anti-terrorism, is kind of interesting. It means that all this discussion of the complexity of the aid objective function really boils down to something that was much more tractable, like anti-terrorism. But now if we think about the future roles of development banks, and I've just come from our annual meeting in Incheon, where we were making a lot of big declarations about where the ADB was going in the future. And that is really looking at the humanitarian crisis that is coming up from climate change. And it would be interesting to see to what extent that, and I realize that the data is not yet there, but are we starting to see that this is another shift in the objective function? Are we moving towards a different regime in terms of the aid community that is more in line with global environmental goals, this transition to net zero, or again, is it being driven by other factors? Something for the future, but I hope to see that his continued career in this area of asking the difficult questions to the aid agencies continues in this direction. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Speglish. Could I call now Professor Florian Alburo? Thank you.
Good afternoon. The disadvantage of being the last speaker is that most of what I wanted to say were already said, and we're left with either telling stories or making jokes. But I don't think I will do any of those. A review of aid effectiveness spanning more than 40 years of research seems to indicate that essentially there is zero relationship between economic growth in recipient countries and aid in this what is called the aid effectiveness literature. The more than 40 years of experiences between the aid industry and the recipient countries have yielded results which cast doubt on the effectiveness of aid. One can term this as the paradox of aid, the subject of what has been discussed, I think, excellently in this forum. Whether one invokes the huge data that can be mined or focus on the banner studies that seem to provide justification for renewed commitment to development assistance, or the new euphemism called poverty reduction, there are an array of technical and methodological issues that remain unresolved, such as the one that has been pointed out by Dr. Easterly in his article in Journal Perspectives in 2013. Indeed, where poverty has been declining in the largest economies that are hardly recipients of aid. And while the main aid recipients have seen poverty reduction slowing down, reinforces this paradox. The basis for much of the findings in the paradox of aid is the cumulative studies that have largely been independent, academic, and non-partisan. With, of course, there are some journals with ideological bent. On the other hand, the aid ministry has been churning out evaluation studies left and right, which shows, for example, that half have been successful and the other half have not been harmful. For example, half have been successful, other have harmful, but as Easterly pointed out again, he's probably right in insisting that evaluations, for example, of World Bank projects should not be far and between, especially if particular studies are the underlying foundations of much of aid policy, such as the one that Boone and Dollar have indicated. A straightforward scatter plot of growth rate and share of aid in GDP reveals this lack of relationship, and the application of regression analysis confirms these zero correlations irrespective of different lag structures. At the micro level, the aggregation of evaluation of aid projects leads to the same aid ineffectiveness. At the macro level, a zero correlation reflects what is called macro-micro paradox. These are stubborn results. The mechanisms by which growth is affected by aid include direct effects on aid on growth, and both the scatter plots and associated regression analysis trace this out. Growth may also be affected by aid via savings and investment behavior, which is meant to finance accumulation, and so on. I think what turns out to be different is that effect of aid on growth may be conditional, and aid helps in some cases, but not in others, while zero correlation does not mean growth and aid are independent. One of this conditionality, for example, is what's called good policy model. Using good policy index, the weighted sum of budget surplus, inflation, and trade openness. This conditionality means that aid given to countries with good policies help the country. Aid to countries with bad policies harm the countries. It appears, however, that a key coefficient in the good policy model, its index is insignificant and fragile given changes in sample and control variables. The second leading conditional model is the use of aid squared in the specification of growth model. While the coefficient for aid is positive, the coefficient for aid squared is negative. That is, the marginal contribution of aid to growth is negative. The results of looking at either US aid or all donors on recipient countries' governance control, such as governance, control of corruption, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, voice, and accountability, show negative governance dummies, but positive for 2002-2019 dummies. Excluding Afghanistan and Iraq from the data doesn't seem to improve the resulting numbers. After 9/11, shifts in foreign aid, especially US aid, went to poor countries experiencing most violence despite no change in poverty and in overall worldwide conflict. These nuances in the pattern of aid seem to suggest differentiating aid recipients according to their degree of development. For some recipient countries, aid ensuring their survivability as failed or near failed fragile states differ markedly from those states pursuing economic progress. The sample containing the data on aid and recipient characteristics may not be homogeneous, particularly when it comes to the degree of governance. The kinds of expertise needed in these situations presumably call, for example, for constabulary capacities, national security administration, and creating institutions instead of enhancing them, not macroeconomics or trade skills. For example, in 1981, when I was working at the United Nations in Thailand, a memo came across the table asking for volunteers to go to Cambodia. But fresh in my mind in that was the killings fields in Cambodia just a couple of years before that. Now, how can one go there and talk about macroeconomics when in fact what they were looking for was survivability? Therefore, we want to make a differentiation between that. Neither does the solution of creating new institutions on the part of donor governments quite cut it. The matter of survivability clearly suggests institutional development to adequately absorb aid resources, prevent their leakages, and build the roots of markets or social cohesion. The real test of altruism on the part of donor lies in this context of differentiation. On the other hand, there is probably some rationale for donor self-interest once economic development becomes the overriding concerns of aid recipients. Donors would have the wherewithal to tie their aid to their own benefits. These range from procurement restrictions to hiring of donor nationals in the deployment of capacities. What to aim for is to loosen tied aid and work for more flexibility on the part of donors' self-interest. That flexibility may be a function of trust on aid recipients, the credibility of its direction and vision, and the safeguards erected to ensure resources are fully accountable. In my experience, for example, I was told by the staff of the project investment staff that every year in the yen loan package, all these Japanese companies already come here and start lobbying for the purchase of equipment and materials from Japan. And I was told that it's not going to be easy to convince them otherwise. But I did, and I told them we want a different kind of development program. And I said we want that using labor-intensive mechanisms instead of building buildings, capital, etc. And the diplomatic answer was to say, we will consult the capital. Fortunately, a week or so later, they said, we will support you. And that changed dramatically what I call flexibility. A year later, Japan came back and said, we want to do the same thing as what we did before. So it's quite apparent that aid benefits under certain conditions and fails, as in the aid paradox, without the conditions. Perhaps when samples of aid and growth relationship that are more of survivability than of growth itself are finally distinguished, some relationship may turn out to be positive. This may remove the seeming frustration with ineffectiveness of aid. It turns out that aid has positive impact on growth in recipients with good fiscal, monetary, and trade policies. It will have little effects on the presence of poor policies. In short, with a good policy model above, the aid could work. Put differently, a good policy regime becomes a critical part of an effective aid, and the whole array of varying types of aid resources are then provided developing countries that assist them in some growth takeoff. There would, of course, be continuing concerns about the trajectory of aid within existing policies, which may deter or encourage more aid over time. For example, there may be inefficiency in aid use, even within good practices that are imposed by multilateral or bilateral aid requirements. Inefficiencies which could have been avoided, thus a drag on growth despite all good policies. One can then consider that the content of foreign aid itself is policy advice, and what is to be evaluated is its impact on the recipient country in concrete terms. Now, policy advice is a blurry subject, occurs in many ways, and delivered in various modalities. For example, bilateral, multilateral missions, study missions, technical assistance, often carry with them policy advice, knowledge products, and other technical expertise. Given that these may be one-off and deployed for specific purposes, this might not really qualify as policy advice. The point is that aid is effective when conditional on good policies. So, why not look at policy advice itself when provided as foreign aid? What has been the record of such policy advice on recipient countries? This approach directly views aid content as creating those conditions that allow aid to be effective, or to put differently, allow domestic resources to achieve development goals. Unfortunately, there may not be enough samples of aid recipients of policy advice and tracking them. Unlike the macro ways that relate growth rates and aid flows, for which there are innumerable samples, policy advice as the subject of aid may be hard to come by, but it does address some of the inherent problems with foreign aid. The ticklish issue of absorptive capacity would probably be less challenging, since the recipient of policy advice, in general, would have some basic understanding of what's being advised. Both the host and the provider of policy advice can potentially work together in crafting policies, and the recipient country carrying them out. And if the policy advice is provided over a sustained period of time, it may not be tainted by short-run fluctuations, such as business cycles. Finally, even with limited samples, what is important is the replicability of aid and likely lessons learned from these experiences. I will not deal with many samples, but let me just mention one or two, to the extent that time is allowed. Not so long ago, I was an OFW in Singapore, joining these Filipinos every Sunday at Lucky Plaza or Botanic Garden. But one day in Singapore, I read in the newspaper that Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew broke protocol and actually met a private person at the Changi airport. Now, when I say broke protocol, it simply meant that he himself, as head of state, went to the airport and meet this private person. Now, protocol requires his foreign minister should be the one to meet that person, but PM Lee Kuan Yew actually did. And I was wondering, why would he meet such a private person? I read about it. He met an economist by the name of Albert Winsemius, which maybe many of you haven't heard. And Albert Winsemius was Lee Kuan Yew's capacity builder. He was the policy advisor of Singapore, sent by aid, not USAID, but sent by the United Nations Development Program in the early 60s to help design Singapore's development plan. And he stayed on for 24 years advising the Singapore government. Now, what did that accomplish? As I said a while ago, it accomplished a lot of things. First, the recipient must understand and must have absorptive capacity. And that's what Lee Kuan Yew had. He didn't probably understand much about economics, but at least he tried his best. Now, why do I say he tried his best? Because he went out of his time to really understand what was that policy advice being given. For example, if you read his autobiography, which has several sections on Albert Winsemius, he says, Albert Winsemius is a chain smoker. He smokes like a chimney. I don't smoke. But Lee Kuan Yew said, I had to endure the smoke because I wanted to know what he was talking about. Now that is something that really means absorptive capacity. Second, Lee Kuan Yew traveled with Albert Winsemius and Albert Winsemius stayed on for, as I said, 24 years. That is a very long period of time to talk about policy advice. And that's the reason, I guess, why he actually personally met Albert Winsemius. Now, fast forward 20 years later, the Singapore intellects are still questioning, was it Lee Kuan Yew who was responsible for Singapore's development, or was it Albert Winsemius? That is still debatable. You can actually Google it, and it's still debatable. But when Albert Winsemius died, there was a chair created for him at the Nanyang Technological University to try to trace everything that he did in Singapore. They, of course, gave him a medal and named a road after him. It's called Albert Winsemius Lane. All 90 meters of lane in Clemente. It's not as long as Imelda Avenue or Marcos Highway, but it was meant to honor Albert Winsemius. This particular sample that I have shown relates to a lot of things. One is that you can relate growth and aid, and in this case, over a 24-year period. Second, there was a lot of rapport and BFF between Lee Kuan Yew and Albert Winsemius. And that, I think, already speaks for itself. There's a second sample that I have, which also is transformative. And this is the role of policy advice provided by two Taiwanese, S.C. Chang and T.C. Liu, during the formative years of Taiwan. Now, that was not a point of aid not being given because there was no good policy. The trade policy in Taiwan at the start was very bad, right? And the idea was to reform the trade policy. But it was actually a wrong idea because Taiwan was getting aid regularly from the US. In fact, it was like Israel in the US, and therefore they didn't have to worry about not getting aid. But they had to understand that aid is not going to last forever. And that's the reason why they had to talk about policy advice. And the policy advice given was not with aid organizations, although S.C. Chang and T.C. Liu were IMF staff before they came to Taiwan. And of course, we can predict what they were proposing. And their proposition was devaluation. Devalue the NT dollar, right? But there was, of course, very good reason for that. They calculated the overvaluation of the currency, and as a result of that, the rest is history. From 3 major exports of rice, sugar, and coconut, many major exports without rice, sugar, and coconut. So therefore, if we are going to talk about aid to be given because there are good policies, why not talk about policy advice? And that should be a food for thought. In short, once, as I said in my last paragraph, it seems to be clear whether policy conditions and the associated advice that led to good policies overcome the aid paradox and usher in more aid, or more importantly, achieve sustained economic growth and draw in non-aid resources. Whether in the presence of good policies, aid works, would also seem to be immaterial if the combined policies eventually become growth-promoting. In this sense, the right policies need to be independently pursued, and their ingredients have been laid out here. Thank you very much.
It's now time to open our discussions from with our participants, both on-site and online. There will be two ways by which you can raise questions. The first is for those who are currently here in the room. Just go to the microphone stand and wait for your turn to ask your question or raise your hand. Given the short time that we have for the open forum, keep your interventions very short and succinct, please. For the online participants, we still have about 150 left. Please use the Zoom chat box and send your questions and comments as private messages to the moderator. Thank you. Are there? Let's open the floor for questions. There is the first question.
Hello po.
Wait, just hold on a minute. I missed something. The speakers are asked to come in front, and please have a seat. All right. Can we have the first question, please? If you have any specific person you wish to address the question to, please say so. Thank you.
Yes, good afternoon po. Thank you for that wonderful talk. I am asking this question on behalf of Joseph Bolintiam. Question po for Dr. Easterly. In the studies you mentioned, was there a variable that controlled for a measure of U.S. interest and political control or goodwill with the country? For example, U.S. aid going towards Afghanistan, and they have oil or military control interests in the region, or going towards the Philippines as a strategic ally in Asia. This could be a potential reason for donating against the paradox.
So do I understand correctly, you're asking for the effect of the recipient's goodwill towards the United States?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a very timely question because we have a major new example of U.S. aid policy shifts, which is associated with the war to Ukraine. And you know, we could speculate. So this is only speculation, and it's going to be a long time before we know the answer. But maybe aid to Ukraine might work better than aid to Afghanistan did because Ukraine has much more of a domestic constituency in favor of the government, in favor of the U.S. alliance, and doesn't have a domestic movement resisting, or domestic insurgency movement resisting the U.S. government. So that's, I agree with you, that would be a very different situation.
So to clarify lang po, like, should there be a variable that controls the issue about political control or political goodwill from the U.S. for these aid po?
Yes. Can you suggest one?
No po, sige. Thank you po.
All right, another question. Why don't I go, oh there, Carl Handok.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation, Bill. Just a few questions about some of your methods which can, you know, drive your results. Do you have in your robustness checks breakdown by periods? For instance, after 2001, 2002 to 2006, 2011 to 2015, and so on and so forth. Maybe the result is driven by early years after 9/11, which reflected national security priorities versus development priorities. So for instance, maybe in latter years, the priorities shifted from national security to more developmental priorities for USA. So breaking down those periods may reflect those. Second is that in your robustness check, you only take away Afghanistan and Iraq. What if you control for extremist hotspot countries, Philippines included? So maybe this extremist or countries in danger of extremism, if you control maybe the sign or significance of your governance or whatever measures may change. Also, is it possible that aid improved governance outcomes? Maybe the causation will be on the other side, or the so for instance, USAID aid give improved regulatory quality, may improve the regulatory regime. I was part of a project that USAID funded purportedly to improve regulatory quality, so I hope it has increased our ranking then. So in that case, the causality may be in the other direction rather than from governance to aid. And finally, I have your book since I was a grad student, but this is, like I said last night, only a photocopy because I was poor then. I'll have you sign it later. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you. Those are really excellent comments and things to investigate further in the next revision of the paper. And especially the causality one is really interesting. Is it, to what extent could aid be? So we have a negative correlation between aid and governance of the recipient. I'm interpreting that as causality going from governance to the aid decision to give money to that recipient, but maybe aid is making the governance worse than the recipient. That's a level of cynicism and negativity that I really aspire to, and I'm glad you set a great model for me to follow. By the way, let me also thank very much the superb comments and insights from the discussants, which I will have learned a lot from and will be incorporating in the next version of the paper.
We have some online questions. Here is one from Carl of NCPAG. And I don't know, it's not addressed to any specific speaker. The question is there a way in giving donations or aid to displaced people in conflict-ridden countries while working around the combatants? And then also, given that other developing countries which have muddled histories and autocratic tendencies are usually not compatible or receptive with Western-style democracy, are there ways in strengthening these countries' institutions that would be appropriate for their local contexts and cultures? So I don't know which one of you would wish to answer that. Perhaps Ryan would.
I think we'll put USAID in charge of this one.
The first question on how to contribute how to best contribute to organizations that are dealing with people who have...
I think giving help to people in displaced, in conflict-ridden countries and working with the combatants. So those are actually leading the armies, etc. Do you have any experience in that?
Yeah, there's no easy answer to that. I think there's plenty of information online about the effectiveness of different organizations and how they're working, but obviously the organizations that are working in these types of areas are facing terrific challenges, narrowing the set of goals, perhaps as the professor was talking about, on survivability versus growth could be an indication of where you may want to target some assistance for personal donations. That's what he's asking.
All right.
Yep.
Here's another question from CGBP, which is for Dr. Easterly. What can you say about security people taking over aid programs, somewhat transforming these from a poverty alleviation framework to a more militaristic approach?
Yeah, I have some dismay that is happening. I mean, that's partly what informed doing this research, is the dismay that sort of U.S. national defense and development policy were becoming, as Secretary of State Clinton put it in a speech in 2010, she said defense and development were complements. And I heard that and I thought, that's not right. That's totally wrong. Or as some of the discussants would call it, thought-provoking. That defense and development are sort of opposites. They're both worthy goals, but they're sort of opposites. You need to do certain things for U.S. national defense that are not good for development, and you need to do other things for development that are not good for defense. And I think a besetting sin that all of us have is to pretend that there are no trade-offs, and the unhappy job of economists is to remind us all that there are very serious trade-offs that we face in the world. So I agree very much with the question.
Yeah. There were two questions which I think Dr. Robert Sveklish raised, which was one on the differences or distinctions between the different types of aid programs. Will it make a difference if you're looking at bilateral aid versus that of multilateral aid, and the role of governing institutions of the multilateral organizations? I think that was the first question which stuck in my mind. Maybe you would like to take this opportunity to answer.
So I was saving this for a meeting that we're having tomorrow at ADB, but I'll give it to you now if you want. ADB actually does a lot better than anybody else. They do actually very well at selecting on need and poverty. I didn't engineer that result specifically for a visit to ADB, but they're actually doing quite well. And they really are. I'm saying this based on not on this study, but on another study that just compared how much different agencies select on need and governance. And sort of the best case is selecting on both high need and good governance. And it is true that those are mostly multilaterals. So it's ADB and the World Bank and the IMF do better on those dimensions. And the ones that are worse are USAID, sorry. And some other rich country bilaterals do worse, and some UN agencies also do badly.
That's true. I think, are there other questions of the... Oh, I see Vic Pacquiao and Dr. Ernie Pernia. Dr. Vic Pacquiao, formerly World Bank and...
I have two questions. The first one is whether aid agencies are like lemmings. They're subject to or victims of groupthink. And this is provoked by your findings about, not just the US, but other donors are following the same kind of movement. And the question, a related question is, do we have enough dissent within the aid agencies community? Like Professor Easterly is a dissenter, for example, so that you can prevent this groupthink, okay, that is not well thought out. Still related to this line of thinking is whether, the controversy that Banerjee and Esther Duflo criticized macroeconomics and growth economics. That it's like the science in the Middle Ages, something like that. And so, in favor of really micro level analysis using RCTs and other experimental methods. to really have a well-founded conclusions and a body of knowledge that is well on empirical, solid empirical evidence. So what I'm really saying, to what extent should we trust your analysis, which uses all this macro level empirical and foundational analysis?
Great question. So there's always this tension between the micro studies that look at whether individual projects or interventions work versus the macro evidence and whether things are working overall. And ironically, that's the case with RCTs themselves. Do RCTs verify that an individual project has some effect of some kind? But you can't use RCT evidence to prove that development using RCTs is possible. To know whether development using RCTs is possible, we'd have to look at, are there cases of development success that relied a lot on using RCTs? It's hard to think of sort of that kind of macro level, any examples of that kind of macro level success. So ironically, if you think of RCTs as evidence-based policy, at the macro level, we don't have much evidence that pursuing evidence-based policy works, that there is evidence for evidence-based policy. The process by which development happens seems to involve lots of other kind of more casual kinds of analysis, but looking at macro and growth and trade and all the things that you were talking about in your remarks on the effect of good policy advice on development and so on. Those are the things that are hard to test with any kind of rigor using RCTs, but it's hard to avoid those questions anyway.
Dr. Pernia?
Yeah, it just occurred to me that, your studies about cross-country analysis, it occurred to me that whether your framework or some modification of it can be applied to the U.S., given the degree of violence in the U.S., something like 198 shootings or rampage over the past 4 months or 5 months, whether that can be applied so that there can be some solution, because there's so much racial inequality and also inequality in incomes and other things, and whether your can be applied so that there can be some solution to an intra-country problem, and that might help the U.S. and you might get a Nobel Prize from of some sort if you are able to address the problem. Thank you.
That's a wonderful insight and suggestion. I agree with you.
All right. I have a very specific question here, which might be applicable to the Philippines. So, what happened to the Millennium Challenge Corporation account, which was supposed to have been very effective during the Pinoy period? I'm wondering whether Mr. Washburn is familiar, and thus got pre-approved for extension during the next administration. Yet it was canceled for the Duterte period. Was this the decision of the U.S., or was it the decision of the Duterte administration?
So glad I don't work for the U.S. government.
The Millennium Challenge Corporation is a separate organization than USAID, so I work for USAID, so and I was not here during the time, so I cannot answer directly to the question. The MCC is, as Dr. Easterly was talking about with that quote from President Bush, was set up to have conditional assistance based on a number of factors, governance being one of them. So that was President Bush's idea, to make aid more conditional based on these international factors. I can't speak to
the very specific concerns.
Closing.
All right, thank you very much. Are there other questions from the floor? Yes, please. Maybe this will be the last question.
Hello, good afternoon. I'm Fan from the UP School of Economics. I'm a student here. First of all, big fan. I wrote a term paper on the Sachs-Easterly debate and the middle ground by Raul Fabella. Anyway, it's interesting that crises tend to shift the priority of donor countries. Another crisis felt by all, but more so by vulnerable countries, is of course climate change. So I'm jumping off of Dr. Zweglich's idea here. Now, one of the solutions to mitigate its impacts is loss and damage financing, which is basically another modality of aid. Now, when we talk about loss and damage financing, selecting recipient countries necessitates a dimension of justice. So, I'm curious, how do you think can we navigate selecting countries based on institutional quality and policy environment with justice concerns? Thank you. Question, by the way, is for either Dr. Zweglish or Dr. Easterly.
So if I understand your question, it's how to select the countries, correct? I think at least my takeaway from the talk was that the selection was going against really what you would want to get for effectiveness, even though that may have been the stated goal, that the true objective function, if you will, overrode that kind of selection criteria. That was, in fact, what was driving my question as to whether MDBs had a different track record by being able to take advantage of a different governance structure that isn't necessarily being driven by single country interests. Although clearly, even at the boards, there are those who are first among equals that tend to see their policies given more weight, and that's where my curiosity came from, was to whether that shows up a difference rather than the overall studies. But maybe I can turn it over to Professor Easterly.
I thought you covered it well.
All right. I think it's time to close the open forum and the questions, and I'm sure later on you can ask the speakers individually on that. Let me thank our speakers, Dr. William Easterly, Mr. Ryan Washburn, Dr. Joseph Zweglish, Dr. Florian Alburo, for the time that you have spent with us this afternoon. It's been very provocative, very interesting, and I hope all of us have had an insight into the way foreign aid programs work and hopefully a better understanding of how they work. At this point, I would like to call Dean Joy Abrenica and Dr. Carl Handok to please come on stage. And they've asked me to say a few little things. Dr. Easterly, we're very grateful for this visit again. We have prepared, would you like to say this? Yes, thank you. I will say it for you. Okay, we have prepared a small token to tell you how much we appreciate your sharing of your expertise. And we're looking forward to a third visit in the future. And maybe it won't take, how many years was that? 14? 14 years. It is an art plate by renowned artist Dominic Rubio titled Tatlong Dalagang Mayumi, or Three Gentle Ladies. The description of the art piece: a famous artist, Dominic Rubio, has become a favorite among major collectors in Asia, the US, and Canada, holding major exhibitions where his signature figures in turn-of-the-century garb with elongated necks, and all of this have been a big hit with audiences. Dubbed as people types, art critics have said that with these figures, Rubio has shown a proud race that can hold its own in the community of nations. This art piece is part of the collections of Gallery Joaquin. Thank you very much once again, Dr. Easterly, and I hope this is a nice souvenir of your time with us this afternoon. And I think there are also small tokens for our other panelists. And then can we invite you all for picture taking with Dean Joy and Chair Carl Handok. Are you going to have a picture taken? Yes, it's in my script. Maybe jointly have a picture. Who will announce these things? Join them. Once again. Okay. So here's a little plug for the upcoming programs of UP PCED. On Monday, May 15, the first lecture of the PCED at 50 lecture series, 50 Years of Economic Policy Making, will be given by Dr. Gerardo Sica. Oh. Okay. There is a special request here for pictures with the students.
Can we ask all
Dean, please.
I'd like to ask all the students to come forward and let's have our picture taken with Dr. Easterly.
Nakaset na ba yung slides? Ulitin ko ulit yung bisita. Sige. Sige, let me return this. Yeah, or si Dean, diba? Yeah, sige.